yeah, unfortunately, and otherwise, and save the rest of the ship instead of going down with the whole ship. I mean, and that's a thing I don't understand at the moment, unfortunately. But that's the difference between business and politics.
Right.
Yeah.
So guys, I'm sorry for the little accident. I think we can kick off. If somebody else is joining, well,
Maiten Panela, but I don't see image and I see the micro is off.
Yeah, and I'm sure she is there. Maiten. And Charles Thoma also joined. So, well, welcome everyone, and I'd like to say a special thanks to our guests today, Pedro, Ben, and Adolfo. We are having this meeting about the current energy markets and the energy models of the future, and we will have 3 talks by them, 15, 20 minutes. And then we'll have a session of Q&A. So just handing over it to Pedro now, who will speak about the world energy trends. So Pedro, you're up, and thank you.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you, everyone. Good evening. Nice meeting you. It is an honor to be with my colleagues at GBO. What I'd like to do this evening, let me share a screen. Let's see if it works the way that it's supposed to work. Can you see it?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. What I'll try to offer you this evening is an innovative way of looking at what energy has meant and is meaning to humankind throughout history, where we are now and where we are going to go into the future. I guess the 2 presenters that we'll do after my little presentation will focus more into the trends in the future. So let me start with a challenging chart that I'd like you to recognize. You know, energy throughout history has been the vector for development. Let's have a look at how. Well, as you know, life in planet Earth started something like between 10 to 15 million years ago, while the universe is 15,000 million years old. The first humanoids started something like 3 to 5 million years ago. So the first hominids, we can say that they were 1.7 million years ago. At the time, the energy available for that civilization was about what I said there, 20 watts a day. I'm going to use here watts. Watts is the equivalent of a machine that is working for you 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So instead of using terawatts or BTUs or other units, we are going to use watts all the time because everybody's much more familiar with that. 20 watts basically per day, all day long, means the 4,000 kilocalories that the human metabolism is having. So at the time, these guys that were hunting, that's all the energy they had available, 20 watts all day long. Well, 10,000 years ago, the fire was controlled. Control by meaning that they were able to have fire from one place to another. The fire was known because rains and storms, they had fire, but they wasn't control. So as soon as they controlled that, they could cook and they could do boil things. So it was much and heat themselves. It was about 40 watts at the time. Well, 4,500 years ago, when the horse and other animals were tamed, they could be used for domestic purposes. So the power multiplied by 3 times, 4 times. While a horse more or less is the capability in terms of power of 3-4 men. So, you know, in terms of these numbers, a normal person, you guys can be spending something like 200 watts during 5 hours, okay, normally in the whole day. You have guys like high-speed runners, 100 meters, they can do an aerobic effort of 1,500 watts during seconds. Cyclists, they can do 400 watts, 5 minutes, that's all. But, you know, human being is regular, is 100 watts. Well, when we go to the 1700, look at what happened from 1.7 million to 1700. So it's 200 years ago. The steam was invented, was started to be used by coal, and then the power increased 10 times from previous, 4 times from the previous civilization. Well, at the mid of the 20th century, oil was got into the equation, and we already had 1,000 watts per person. And then when the nuclear industry became available, is where we are now, 2,200 watts per person. But this is not, this is one way I look at that, but let's have a look at how that is shared throughout civilization. These 2,200 watts that we have available, in average, of the 7.7 billion people, represent that for the USA is 10,400 watts. Average in the European Union is 4,200 watts. In Spain is 3,200. The rest of the world, except countries like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, is 1,700 watts. If you remember from previous chart, that is the power that they have, we had 1 century ago, okay? Now, translating that into energy, the energy that we consume per year is 150,000 terawatts. That is the equivalent of having 17,000 nuclear reactors working 24 hours, 365 days a year. Now, the available energy on planet Earth, okay, is considered to be to the 17th power. So it's in watts. So that is 10,000 more times of what we're using right now. So we are not scared of energy. The planet Earth has 10,000 times more energy available than the one that we're using now. Let's have a look at that. I don't know if you're able to see the small dot on the right, which is the world consumption, 17 terawatts. Just the sun is 5,000 times. Okay, just the sun that we are receiving, not the emissions from sun, because we are getting into Earth about 10% of the radiation of the sun. Then we have wind, we had geothermal, and others. Okay. If we have a look at how this is shared in the world, it's interesting to know that the majority of the energy that is consumed in the world is by burning things. We burn natural gas, we burn oil, we burn coal, and traditional biofuels. By the way, this thing of traditional biofuels that is, not relevant in the whole world, it is very relevant in the third world countries, which is good, basically, because that's the way they heat themselves and they cook. We'll see in a different chart. But the point that I want to make in here is 94.03% of the energy that we consume generates greenhouse effect. Okay, in Spain, since we have a lot of renewables, it's only 74.20 of the energy. I'm not talking about electricity. Okay. If we look at this, so by 2018, that's the last numbers that are available, already solid data. We see that of the global energy, 77% is commercial, 12.6% is residential, 25% is transportation, and 55% is industrial, of which only 19.8% is electricity, okay? Of which 26% is renewable. If we go to the right, we see what I said before. The traditional biofuels represent 73.6% in the global renewable energy consumption. And those traditional biofuels, they are not emission-free, okay? It's burning waste, burning wood, etc. So you have other renewable, you have solar, wind, and hydropower. That's the way that is done. So the messaging here is that yes, the world is electrifying more and more in developed countries, but not all the energy is renewable. So the numbers that the press is telling us about the percentage of how much energy is renewable, we don't have to be confused into being energy or being electricity. One thing true is the 19.8% of electricity out of the total energy is a tremendous increase in the last years. So having said that, I like to finish with this chart that I like you to have. In the last 30 years, the electricity share of the total pie of energy has increased by 40%. So the message is clear, the world is electrifying in all senses. And I will leave that into here so you have some numbers to work on, and I will ask the next speaker to take the floor. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now it's me. One sec. And can you see my screen?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. So this is, we were going from a very energy-based, the history of energy and the use of energy. And I'm coming from a much more startup perspective to the energy industry. So really my take on what's going on today in the industry and how it's moving forward and how that's affecting the utility industry. To understand really what's happening in the utility industry, you have to really understand a base understanding of that we're moving from a centralized system to a decentralized system. Now, the real reason that we even decided to have centralized energy in the first place goes back to the War of Currents in the late 1800s, where Thomas Edison had an idea for a DC generator and Nikola Tesla had one for an AC generator. There was other inventors with different distribution amongst these DC and AC platforms, but the two big contenders were Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. Ultimately, Nikola Tesla's AC generator won out, and the reason being was that it could have a large generator in a central location and you could electrify entire city blocks together. Whereas Thomas Edison's perspective was that you would have a generator distributed equally, and you would have the fuel arriving to those distributed generators and being powered from there. So ultimately what happened when we had this centralized generation, there was a centralized generation marketplace, and this came from four main participants in the market. You had the generators, so you had the utility scale production units far from the cities. They had to come on transmission lines with high voltage to the cities to where they were actually being utilized, where it would go in through the distribution and lastly to the end customer. And that end customer, that fourth part of the market space is called the utility. And the utility's main purpose is to interact with the customer and to keep the logs of how much energy that customer has actually utilized. And so when I'm presenting these different startup ideas today, I'm really focusing on that end use, that utility space, because generation already has technology moving forward with PV, with different wind as well, transmission and distribution as well. But when we start talking about data and services that you can provide to the end customer, you're really looking in the utility space. So the reason that we're moving into this new utility customer or this utility client-customer relationship is because decentralization is on the horizon. So we went from the centralized energy system where we had AC generators distributed equally, not equally, but throughout the system, pumping an entire system full. Now we're moving to a fact that the levelized cost of energy for PV solar has decreased from 2009 to 2019 to now be competitive with any energy on the market. And really the largest reasons that this has been happening has to do with efficiency gains. So the actual productivity of that solar panel, the learning from doing. So the actual constructors that are building these plants already have the understanding and the maps and the layouts and the architecture. Research and development from other parts like tracking, better stands, and better angling. And then lastly, the economies of scale. So when we start talking about, the other trends that are really moving us into this decentralized environment, the decreasing cost of energy storage is a main player. And the reason that we even have such a decreasing cost of energy storage has to do with the fact that there's been so much public push into increasing these industries and actually funding, in the large part, these gigafactories. In Europe, at the beginning of 2017, Europe had 0 planned gigawatt hours of lithium-ion batteries. And that's when the European Battery Alliance came to be, and they started putting money, $500 million per plant for Northvolt, for Saft, and they started putting money to incentivize industry players to get into market. Ultimately, what this has done has drastically decreased the cost of a kilowatt hour of energy storage. And we'll come into, in the next slides, what that means. Lastly, the increase of IoT, or of information. So if you take data just up until 2016, 50% of American households already had smart meters. So you had increased understanding of where energy was on the grid and how it was being utilized, as well as grid-wide. And what that means is the large transformers, the inverters, and the actual grid distribution network. And something that's interesting, that's really accelerating us move into this horizontal energy system, is the development of blockchain. Now, I'm not talking about cryptocurrency and bidding on skepticism, but rather blockchain in the use of IT infrastructure in the way that it's designed so that it provides traceability. If you look at the largest blockchain ecosystem for energy, it's the Energy Web Foundation, and they have over 87 partners already. These are the top utilities, original equipment manufacturers, oil and gas, and distribution, and we'll come back to them. Ultimately, these 3 trends of increased information across the grid with IoT, decreasing cost in energy storage, and decreasing cost in renewable energy assets is ultimately changing that market space. And what we see is that the cost of technology is decreasing, the understanding and the distribution of energy is increasing, and it's meeting in this middle to where the utility company now has to provide energy as a service. So what that really looks like is that in the old system, when we had this 4-part generation system, it was centralized, predictable, vertically integrated, and unidirectional. But as we transition into this digital renewable energy system, it's going to be distributed because solar panels are going to be on all households. It's going to be intermittent because energy is only produced when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. And it's going to be horizontally networked because household to household, that energy is going to have to be levelized between households with solar panels. And lastly, bidirectional has to do with the fact that energy storage is going to have to be there to absorb extra energy production during the times of energy surplus and utilization during the times of energy missing energy. So what does that mean? So if we go back to the 3 trends that we were talking about before, which is the decreasing cost of renewables, the decreasing cost of energy storage, and the increasing use of IoT, the big problem with renewable energy is the intermittent. And what I mean by that is that historically speaking, you have a demand peak in the morning. So if you look on the left-hand side, the small blue hill, as well, then you have the peak of solar during the day, and then solar goes down because the sun starts to go down before people arrive home and the energy increase. And so ultimately what has to happen for us to take advantage of that solar penetration and to increase solar development across our energy systems is that we have to flatten the demand curve, or we have to load shift energy into times that we have energy that you see on the right-hand side. Additionally, if you start looking at the increase in the market space of that energy storage lithium-ion market space, you'll see that the majority of that energy storage is going to go directly into electric vehicles. And the reason being is because people are buying electric vehicles for transportation, not to decrease their energy cost. And therefore, electric vehicles are going to be the main place for those lithium-ion batteries to arrive first. As such, when the decreasing cost of lithium-ion continues, it'll start to move into other appliances and around the household. So what this means is that we currently, in 2018, had 5.2 million electric vehicles in the entire world. In 2030, they're already expecting to have over 160 million electric vehicles. An electric vehicle takes around 3,000 kilowatt hours per year and is parked for 95% of its life. And so in reality, what an electric vehicle will be is an energy storage asset on wheels that can move throughout the system. And so what does that bring to us is this bidirectional aspect of what electric vehicles could provide to the grid. So this bidirectional smart charging outlook is that you already have what's called V1G, or unidirectional controlled charging. What this means is that you can determine when the electric vehicle is charging so that when you have a surplus of energy, you can charge the electric vehicle. In the future, we're moving to a V2G grid, whereby you have a bidirectional charging where this excess energy can be put into the electric vehicle, but additionally, this energy can be sucked out of the vehicle and back into the grid. And in the future, the next step of V2G is going V2H, which is vehicle to home or vehicle to building. And this is actually moving energy around the system based on where those vehicles are going to be in the future and predictions of the future. If we look at the blockchain horizon and the horizontal network, first we have to understand that the blockchain use cases for energy are not immense, but there are different structural participants for the blockchain and energy. You have energy infrastructure, which has to deal with traceability of renewable energy. You have tokenizing energy. So this is paying for energy plants upfront, or actually this is the renewable investment. So incentivizing renewable investment has to do with the fact that you can buy into renewable projects today through cryptocurrency, tokenizing energy. But the most important thing that I want to talk about here that's going to create this new digital system is the peer-to-peer marketplace. And the reason that we're talking about the peer-to-peer marketplace is because my house having solar panels and the next door neighbor's house having solar panels, I might need more energy at 4 p.m. and him at 6 p.m. And there's going to be that marketplace for us to exchange energy and to exchange value. And so really, the most used case of blockchain energy right now is actually in infrastructure and traceability, but we're moving into all of these different tools will build into a peer-to-peer marketplace for energy trading on microgrids. So ultimately, what this really means is that these three trends, which is the decreasing cost of renewables, decreasing cost of energy storage, and uptake of IoT, is creating a new energy market, which is intermittent energy, decentralized system, bi-directional, and horizontally organized. And what that means for you as a founder is that there's an abundance of places that you can actually create an energy service for a utility company. So utility company is actually going to move to the service-based business model in which they're offering services to their end customer, and you learning how to utilize the energy data of end users and provide them a service is what's going to create the service of the future. And what I mean by that is the first case here. Normally, when we start thinking about energy startups, we think about batteries or we think about EV charging, which is the second one. But one of the most interesting things that I challenge the founders or you founders to think about is much like the first one. House is monitoring elderly family with electricity data. So they're going into this security space for family members and for elderly care, but by analyzing the energy data of the household. And those are the places, the services that we don't really know what's going to happen yet, that the most value is going to be created, is how can a utility company utilize its energy data in order to provide more value to its customers. Another example of utility companies getting into this space is that they'll be better home insurers, because they'll have more information on how that home was upkept and how that home was utilized throughout its lifestyle or its lifetime. So therefore, it'll have more data to provide a better insurance policy for that home versus a natural home insurance policy. Additionally, you have EV charging platforms, EV boxes, specifically from Engie. They already are going on roaming. But most interesting, if you look at the Spanish use case, you already have a large battery manufacturer that's being expanded and recently bought by Repsol. They were founded, I think, in 2014 and purchased by Repsol in 2019. Additionally, in the blockchain space, you have FlexiDAO, which is providing traceability for utility companies. Acciona, Iberdrola are under their customer list. They already have 92.6 gigawatt hours per day of traceability of energy assets. And on the crowdfunding side, you have a company called Funding that's pushing community-based solar, where you can invest for just 500 euros into a solar project. And so these different use cases of energy data is really where the space is going. Now, when you're looking from a startup perspective, the most important thing is how are you going to pay for it? And this is kind of what the interesting thing about the energy space is right now, is that it's very open, innovation intensive. There's so many different organizations that are intending to go to a renewable and a green system that you have regional funding to transition. You have the EIT Inno Energy, which provides professional learning, masterclasses, and an accelerator itself, which comes directly from the European Commission. Additionally, you have the Horizon 2020 and their Green New Deal. These things are from the public side. On the private side, you have, incubators, which are very early stage, accelerators with utility companies, again, with the European Union. But what you're moving into is this piloting program stage where large scale customers are already looking to take technology to the next stage. Free Electrons is the largest piloting program for energy, has over 10 of the world's largest utility companies with over 82 million customers. In Madrid specifically, in the mobility space, you have Madrid in Motion and put on, as well as by the Metro, and additionally Train Labs, which is put on by Renfe and Wyra. And so ultimately, from a startup's perspective, when I'm talking about the utility industry and moving into this space, think beyond energy is what I want to say, and think for services for the household, because that's what the utility of the future will be, providing services to the end customer and to the household. Alberto?
Thank you, Benjamin and Pedro. Now I'm gonna share my presentation. Can you see correctly the presentation? Hello?
Yes, it looks good.
Yes, we can see. I can see it.
Okay, my presentation is based on talking a little bit about the power grids and generation technologies in the energy mix of today and into the future. Pedro has talked about the overall energy trends, and Benjamin has been talking mostly about the startup environment in the end user scenario. So my presentation is divided into a brief introduction. Second, I will talk a little bit about power grids of the future, what is happening at the power grid level, giving some few information, because this topic is so immense that we can be talking for hours here. So the idea is just to give key data for you to understand, and so we can have a talk later on. And the third, I would like to talk about a little bit about the storage and generation technologies that are being inserted in the new energy mix in our countries, and summarizing with some key ideas. So here we see, taking the USA example, a projection of what is going to be the future energy mix in one of the biggest energy consumption countries in the world, that is the US. Is not, and we can see that renewables are going to increase in their penetration in the energy mix, but as many people can think, they will need to cooperate with other technologies as nuclear, fossil fuels, basically natural gas and coal. So the idea of a pure renewable energy grid is today very, very difficult to implement in reality. I mean, we can talk about policies and politicians dreaming about a fantastic world, but physics and reality finally applies. You can see by 2050, mostly there will be a huge penetration of renewables of 38% in the USA, mostly from solar and wind. Of course, there are several scenarios that has to be analyzed, because there are so many variables and so many factors to be accounted that the scenarios can vary very, very huge. In the reference case, a scenario that we are seeing, we will continue to see a decrease in the cost of wind and solar, and also in the natural gas combined cycle technologies. Here we can see a graph of what Benjamin was talking, is the increase on the end use generation, mostly of solar PV, self-consumption projects in the residential, commercial, and industrial businesses. And this has to be taken into account for the future energy mix scenarios. Here we see also some important data that is not normally discussed in the conferences about the future scenarios of renewables. Of course, there is, as Benjamin said, a huge decline in cost in the generation side, but this huge penetration of renewables will translate into increasing cost at the distribution and transmission levels. So we will see what will be the overall cost of implementation of these new technologies in the future energy mix. Also, electrical vehicles will be another factor to be considered. And in this graph, you can see what will be the end use of electrical vehicles in USA by 2050. And still, these are going to be projections because it's very difficult to forecast the real scenario that we will encounter in the future. What that means for power grids. We've been talking about fancy and new technologies that are coming to the market, but this is having a huge impact in a power grid that we are utilizing every day and that has been created and developed for more than 100 years since Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison were fighting at the beginning. So what this is, what are the key trends that are going to affect the power grids in the future? Basically, it's going to be the pace of retiring baseload power plants, basically coal-fired power plants in Europe, the increased renewable energy penetration, and the distributed generation at the household, commercial, and industrial levels, the rising investment in energy efficiency and demand response that we will have in 5-10 years, and the technological innovation in electrical vehicles and storage. So let's review some of the main challenges and opportunities ahead of us. And as I said, it's a huge variety of topics that we can discuss, but I would like to point out some of them. This is a figure that Benjamin also basically was explaining at the beginning. Just today, our power grid was designed for a baseload power generation, basically big power plants far away from the demand places that were basically the cities and the industrial areas. Nowadays, what we have is a penetration of intermittent renewable sources from wind and solar. And we are coming into a more complex grid that will need to take into account more solar and wind, batteries, and generation at the demand side of the spectrum. From a renewable generation point of view, what kind of problems we will have from power grid? Basically, is the first will be that the intermittent generation profile of wind and solar is already causing quite some troubles for transmission system operators here in Europe and USA, because at the beginning there was so little generation that it was easily to handle. But nowadays we are reaching a huge percentage of renewable penetration in the grid, and these are creating a lot of troubles to transmission system operators and grid operators to dispatch this energy and to predict what is going to be the generation profile due to this intermittent problem. And another main problem we are finding now in countries, for example, like in Spain, is that the most promising sites for wind and solar are being located far away from the load centers. These are causing huge pressure to the transmission system planning that normally takes a lot of time for example, in Europe and in USA to be built due to regulation and permitting. Here we can see a snapshot of the renewable generation sources. Here is wind resource map in the USA. So basically, we can see that we cannot decide where the resource is. Basically, we need to go and find it. This, of course, creates, as I was saying, a problem of location of this new capacity and the development of new transmission lines and substations from the transmission system operators to move all this energy from the locations to the load centers. Here we can see the variability of renewable generation. Wind blows within a profile, but varies also year by year. And also the climate change phenomenon is also creating more variability to the generation profile of the power assets. So this is creating another level of uncertainty predicting this generation profile. Here we can see also the resources of solar PV that are not homogeneous within a country. This is an example from USA. We can see the states of Texas and California very rich in solar production, where the East Coast is not so. This, for example, is the generation of a solar PV asset within a sunny day and a cloudy day, and you can see the difference in the profile and how this can be impacting into the daily by daily operation of the grid. Here is a famous a curve called the duck curve. It's in California because basically in this state is one of the states where more solar PV assets has been deployed in the last years. And you can see here in this graph the differentiation or the change in the load profile from year 2012 to year 2020, in which in the time of sunny radiation, a lot of solar PV assets are producing, so lowering down what is called their potential overgeneration. And by when the sun goes, you have a peak on demand. So there is an incredible ramp of new generation that needs to come online to provide this energy to the end users. This is creating stress and very important difficulties to the transmission operators to operate the grid and to put new generation in place when these solar PV assets are offline. So what happened with renewable generation, and what are the opportunities for companies to provide solutions to these challenges? Basically, industry and governments need to work together to share meteorological data so they can improve the wind and solar power production forecast. As we have more and more renewable penetration in 2 degrees, the governments has to improve the mechanisms to provide incentives for investment in flexible generation, and operating flexibly should be deployed. We cannot forget about the regulatory frameworks in which this investment has to be implemented, because even though we have the technology, if the regulation and the standards are not in place, the assets cannot be deployed because the investment case is not met. And also there has to be expanding cooperation among neighboring balancing areas. This means interconnection between countries and states. For example, in Spain, we have the problem that we are an island, energy speaking. So in order to increase the penetration of renewables, we need to increase our interconnections with basically France. On a distributed generation and electrical vehicles spectrum, here we can see summary of the theoretical benefits, basically based on emission benefits, power quality benefits, economic benefits, and reliability. But the reality is much more complex than that. So more and more problems are arising every day when coming down to implementing the systems. Here is another example. For example, problems we have at the interconnection of solar PV. As the generation source is intermittent, we have fluctuations at distribution voltage level. So we need to create new systems to control the voltage. There are many companies that are now making research and development to overcome these challenges and new problems that are arising at the power grid level. For example, the charging of electrical vehicles is something that has to be detailedly analyzed because it has a very important impact in the distribution networks and overloading of transformers. So, of course, as we think that it's going to be very easy to massively expand the electrical vehicles, the charging phenomena and how these type of chargings are implemented into the power grid can have huge impact. So solutions has to be founded and applied. So basically, as to the distribution generation and electrical vehicles arises opportunities for companies to try to find solutions to the problem at the power grid level. So just moving forward to the storage and generation technologies in the energy mix, I would like to show you some graphs of what can be seen in the future, taking the example of UK, which has been doing really sound analysis and scenarios. So here in this slide, you can see what can be the energy generation mix of United Kingdom in a 2 degrees scenario. This 2 degrees scenario is the most, let's say, reducing carbon emissions to 0. And as you can see, basically gas power generation and coal power generation is out of the energy mix by 2050. But we need nuclear in a huge proportion to make the numbers up. So basically, renewables is part of the solution, but not whole part of the solution in this scenario. If we go to a steady state scenario, not meeting that ambitious target of 0 CO2 emissions by 2050, you can see that the energy mix is completely different. And you see that the gas power generation now has a huge percentage of the share, and the variation of technologies differs completely. So my point here is that countries should and must analyze what is going to be the potential scenarios for deployment of generation technologies, and it can have a complete different structure between different assumptions. Key insights from National Grid for the UK basically point out to key technologies like new nuclear that is going to be needed, continue technological innovation and progress in onshore wind and solar PV. Offshore wind is going to be also in the scenario, and new technologies like energy storage with lithium-ion batteries and pumped hydro. Here you can see also different scenarios in which nuclear has a different share in the energy mix depending on technologies being implemented and different policies applied. Also, storage can be in a different proportion inserted in the in the energy grid in the UK, considering different scenarios and policies. And also the interconnection capacity between the UK and the continental Europe. And this slide, I'm also finishing now, points out, I think is very, very nice graph in which we see a lot of these new technologies that are out in the media and the newspapers, they are talking, but what are the ones really coming now into the market? You can see in the graph on the right side, you see the ones that are on the most right side are available to buy today. On the middle point, it's going to take 10 years to get into the market. And in the left part of the graph, it will take more than 20 years. So solar PV at the household, commercial and industrial level is one of that we have available today. But as you can see in the graph, that has a big impact, and that business models has to be changed, and changes in regulation must be implemented. Electrical vehicles, number 8, and solid state batteries are coming now also. And you can see it's another example, nuclear fusion with the ITER project that is being developed in France will take more than 20 years to come into the market. So what is the summary of the key ideas I want to give with my speech is that the design of the future energy mix should be done based on a rational approach, avoiding predefined ideas. I don't like to see, from my personal point of view, defining technologies that are good or bad, or energy sources that are good or bad. I think all energy sources are good, and that each country must define what is the most ideal policy and design for their countries, accounting technology, cost, environmental and regulatory inputs, among others. Also, I want to point out that even though we are having a lot of new technologies coming out, reality is much more complex, and there are many problems that are also being arising today due to the insertion of these new technologies. So new solutions will need to be researched, developed and implemented in the future to clearly produce these new future grids. Also, we have to take in mind that government regulatory framework and regulation must be ahead of the technological developments. That is not happening today. Technological developments are going faster than regulation, and regulation is making many of these technologies to be not economically feasible to implement nowadays because the regulation is not in place. And also, I will point out at the end that because of this new environment and this fast transition, there are new opportunities for many companies to participate in the market, in the energy market, which was a very traditional market in which only big corporations like utilities were capable of developing projects. But with this new revolution of renewable energy, startups and medium-sized companies can participate now, providing innovative solutions that are required in the market. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been really interesting. And now questions and answers for everyone. So I'll look for raised hands or just unmute yourself and go ahead. In the meantime, while you think, I'll throw out my first one. It goes to all three of you. What do you think that is the critical point preventing the e-car to completely substitute the current paradigm of fuel fossil fuels in cars? Is that regulatory? Is that geopolitical? Is that related with the grid, with batteries? What would you say that it's the key point that is preventing e-car to develop?
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, I think first we have to understand that it's really arriving. Daimler or Mercedes has stopped any innovation into petroleum-based vehicles and has put all of their money going forward into EVs. And so that paradigm is already shifting, really. But really kind of everything that all the things that you said, you know, the regulation, the grid infrastructure, as well as the technology, because just of the weight of energy density for the battery itself, all of these things play a part into why it's not commercially viable at a complete takeover scale. But when you look at the decreasing cost of PV, for example, and this understanding of better infrastructure and better technology, it's ramping up, and it will you know, have that paradigm shift. But it's really several things. I mean, when you look at energy storage, it doesn't make sense today because there's not the regulations where the energy storage could make money from being an energy storage asset. And so that's one part of it. At the same time, the technology of lithium, because we're only talking right now specifically about lithium ion, but really energy storage can be many different things. It's just that the battery is chemical energy storage. And so this is another aspect of, will electric vehicles of the future even have chemical batteries? This is I mean, the current answer is yes, of course, but in 20 years, it might look differently looking back. So it's really all those things you said, technology, regulation, and the grid itself. I mean, these things are all create the market space.
Thank you.
I can also say something about that. I mean, I agree for the answer of Benjamin, regulatory aspects, technological aspects, physics, the power grid problems, but policies, I think at the policy level, for example, in Europe and US, we are having support for this kind of new technology of EV cars, but nobody's talking about taxation. And I think it's a big factor. What will happen with the taxation, for example, of electrical energy being used to recharge vehicles, when a government is not taking all that taxes that were taken before from oil for the burning for the traditional cars. I mean, my point is that nobody's talking about that. I think no government is not going to tax that energy because they will have a huge deficit in their accounts when we are transitioning from traditional vehicles to electrical vehicles. Nowadays, one of the incentives you have is that you're charging your car with a very low cost, right? But I think in the future this will change because taxation is there, and now countries basically when you are putting gasoline in your car, you are basically putting taxes in your car. 60% of the gasoline are taxes. So when in the future we will have all the infrastructure, let's say, imagine a future scenario in which we have a lot of EV cars and we can charge our EV cars at home and in petrol stations or electrical stations, taxation will be there and the cost will be completely different. Nowadays in Norway, for example, they have changed these subsidies for charging electrical cars. And now they have found out that it's more expensive to run an electrical car than a traditional car in Norway, just because of taxation. So it's much more complex than only these factors, but I think taxation for me is going to be crucial.
I'd like to add something on the two observations from my colleagues. Regulation, taxation, that's for sure, but from a technical standpoint, the weak link, without a doubt, for the electrical vehicles, to my view, is batteries. Right now, it's 5 to 7 kilos per kilowatt hour, which is an immense weight for a car. That's one thing. The other thing is a scarcity of materials you have for battery construction and all the waste that you are going to originate, toxic waste of batteries that will have a last life of 5 to 7 years the most. I think electrical vehicle will happen. Taxation will be changed for sure. Regulation will be changed. But I think electrical vehicles, which by the way make much more sense than combustion vehicles because they are rotational motors, that's it. And a car is something that makes rotation in your wheels. But what I think it will happen will be the hydrogen and fuel cells. I think that is the direction that electrical vehicles are going to happen in the next decade or so.
Well, what I would like to add is compliments for the story. I mean, it gave me a great insight in which direction we probably are going. But I also miss a few points when talking about the batteries. I mean, I missed the point about the child labor next to the raw material, the way it's won in Africa. I mean, which is a very serious point. And I have also a feeling that especially after the Corona crisis, many people start to doubt the meaning of politicians. There's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of lobbying involved. Things like following people what they do with their data. I mean, everybody is getting afraid of Big Brother is watching you. That's a few things which I miss in this whole discussion. Another thing which I miss is, I mean, a few other important developments, which are developments about hydrogen. I mean, I also know that many car manufacturers are in fact investing in electricity because this is what politicians are driving it in what directions politicians are driving it. But hydrogen offers many more possibilities. It's much cheaper. It's much easier. Not so many things about batteries, electricity, and all the other things. And what else was I going to say? Well, I mean, sorry, but this is one of the. Oh yeah, I missed the aspect of thorium with respect to nuclear energy. Thorium is also, I mean, it's a much cheaper raw material, which can easily be won, which is also, I mean, regarding pollution, what nuclear energy is bringing. I mean, this is, I don't understand why this is not in the present in this discussion, because they are important developments going on in the market. So, and let alone, I mean, all the people, and I'm one of them, hating all these windmills on the land as well as in the sea. I mean, it's disgusting. I mean, it's pollutional landscape, or it's landscape pollution. I mean, I think in that light, it's a very positive discussion, but there is another thing which might pop up because of the Corona crisis, maybe, because people are getting fed up with politicians and driving us into, and especially the money involved. I mean, we're talking about billions, what they want in the EU, and nobody has the money at the moment. I mean, I'm afraid that the whole project might be delayed for many more years because the money simply isn't there, and the countries are choosing for themselves instead of investing something in the EU in order to try to achieve something where many people have doubts about it as well. I don't believe it's the ideal direction, electricity, but that's a personal opinion.
Okay. So you believe in thorium?
Well, what I know and what I read about it, I mean, about thorium, what it is, I mean, I'm not the expert.
But it's still an electricity generator, right? So, I mean, you still take thorium and you create electricity, so it still has to go through the electric system.
Absolutely, but it's a much more, what I understand, cheaper way. It's a much more easier way, and it's a way which is not being investigated. And it's the same for nuclear energy. We're building windmills and subsidizing big electricity companies in order to invest in that. I mean, and it's not. It's like with other things. I mean, it's not the whole picture. It's not the windmill.
Sure.
It's the lifetime of the windmill. It's the maintenance of the windmill. I mean, you can imagine, I mean, what you have to do at sea, I mean, to keep this all alive.
For sure. But if you look at the European Utility Week in 2019, the headliner was nuclear makes a comeback. And so I completely understand and completely agree with what you're saying, that we need to start investigating in this fourth stage nuclear generation. In fact, I started my energy time on a U.S. submarine as a nuclear operator. So we were with uranium-235, and I agree with you that thorium and this molten salt reactor is this new space that we should definitely be investigating. But again, when you start talking about even investigating thorium and these nuclear alternatives, that takes a lot of public funding. The level of nuclear understanding that we have today, that all came from the US military. That came from the US military intending to power US nuclear submarines around the world indefinitely, where they only had to come up for food and water. And so even if I completely don't disagree that it's a lot of political space that we have to talk to in order to get electrical vehicles, but if we want to look at those other high-risk technologies, that is going to take a lot of public funding as well. And the only place that's doing that currently is China. And so I completely don't disagree with you whatsoever, but in fact, I don't think it's the politicians, well, it is the politicians' problem, but it's not that the politicians don't want nuclear, it's that the people don't want nuclear. And the people don't understand what molten salt reactor is and the fundamental differences between a light water reactor and a molten salt reactor. And so it's definitely a complex, just you can't bring it tomorrow because it's a better technical solution. I mean, then if you start talking about data and we start talking about doing demand response and changing from a system where it's demand driven, where if there's demand, supply has to be provided, to now a supply driven system, we have to have that data. So there's these like very underlying principles for the next generation grid that currently the human interaction doesn't really like about it. You know what I mean? So I don't disagree.
Yeah, but I also think, I mean, that a few of these things which have much less disadvantages, like the electricity and the raw material thing and the child labor thing, I mean, it's not really being pushed. I mean, because everybody, if they really, and it was mentioned before, also the calculation about are electric vehicles cheaper? I mean, they're getting more expensive. I mean, and if you don't subsidize it, I mean, people get rid of it after 100,000 kilometers and sell it to Eastern Europe instead of driving it another 200 or 300,000 kilometers. So, I mean, it's a very one-sided view of the way we are going. And I think don't underestimate what may be going on in the public area as a kind of a counterforce, because people are no longer going to accept what politicians want.
I'd like to remind you one number that I mentioned while I was presenting. Electricity represents now 19.8% of the total energy expense. It is growing, but it's only 19.8. So all that you said about nuclear reactors, and Ben, you and I can have inside cooperation, because yes, I founded the first company in Spain about thorium called LISA, all the subcritical reactors. So I'm pretty familiar with that. But the problem here is that first we need to move into electricity. We have an 80% room of improvement, moving to electricity. And once we move that, let's optimize that. But as Benjamin was saying, and he's very, very keen in that, all these big developments are subsidized by big subsidies of governments. And after coronavirus, there's just no money left, unfortunately. Unfortunately.
That's a good point. So Alvaro has his hand raised, so go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Pedro, Benjamin, and Alberto. It was a nice presentation. I have learned a lot. I have one question for Benjamin and something to add to the other things you have mentioned about the car, the change of electricity, on all this discussion, this interesting discussion. First of all, for Benjamin, you have mentioned that the future will be a decentralized system whereby we could sell and buy energy peer-to-peer. But how do you feel, or how do you foresee that this system will be improved? Because at this stage, the energy is controlled by the governments. How are you going to convince the government that one of the main income way of incomes are going to live for free for the people? Because, for example, I was speaking with Miguel a month ago about he was planning to put some solar devices at his home, and I told him, okay, be careful, because this is not for you. You have to sell to the government, and after that, the government will sell it back to you, the energy. So in this scenario, how do you forecast that everything could change to move to a peer-to-peer system?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question, and you noted something very important about that. And the fact is that governments were going to lose control. And so if we actually talk a bit more about the interconnection of countries and of states and their electric systems, they don't want to interconnect, because then that central government loses control of the energy system and thus the control of the people. And so from my perspective, the issue in moving to a peer-to-peer place, rather than, I mean, of course, the technological issue of how do you balance the grid, how do you balance the low voltage grid, because currently the low voltage grid is not balanced. The bigger issue is the fact that those central governments don't want to lose that control over their constituents. And so it comes more from that perspective. But when you then look at the utility perspective or large company perspective, this is actually an opportunity to them. And so they're pushing for this. And we're seeing a new dynamic, because there's still going to need to be a grid. So somebody is still going to be able to tax the energy going on the low voltage grid from my house to your house. It still has to have a transmission from my house to your house, or a distribution, right? So that energy moving is still could be taxed, right? But then coming back from the utilities perspective, the reason that they see it as an opportunity is much like telecommunications in the early 2000s, is that they could massively expand their area of operation. So if you have a company that's only offering today in, say, Spain, now, because if I provide the financing for solar panels on your house, I have now become your energy provider. So utility companies are increasing to put pressure onto moving to a community-based system, because they can increase the number of assets that they have in a geographic sense. And this is putting pressure on the national government to release that control. So what I want to reinstate is that I think that the issue is that the governments don't want to lose control of the energy system, right? And they still have the ability to make money from this energy being transmitted, but it's not that the loss in value of money that they're worried about. It's the loss in control of saying who gets energy and having that ultimate control over the population. So I agree with what your sentiment, but I see it from a different perspective. It's control rather than financial control.
Okay. I have another question for Adolfo. Adolfo, taking into consideration the graphics you have shown us, do you feel that we are going to change from the old energy system to a new energy system whereby the renewable energies will be predominant?
That's for sure.
Are they efficient enough to give this step to stand to be the most important source of energy for Europe, for example?
Well, I think in energy sector, politics are well involved and in deep roots. Here, for example, in Europe, we have different ideas between countries. You compare, for example, Spain with Germany or UK, you clearly see completely different trends of development where renewables are there, but they are complemented with different technologies and with different regulatory frameworks. For me, at the end, what people need is reliable electricity at the lower cost possible. right? So this is something that politicians repeat like a mantra with renewables, but the reality is completely different. If we want an increase in renewable penetration in Europe, we will need to pay more. That's the reality. So, because like, for example, the case in Germany, where they decided by a political move to close all nuclear reactors, what they are now doing is burning coal like crazy, increasing their CO2 emissions, and depending on the gas that they import from Russia. So, and not having a really impact in the retail prices for people. So basically we are being manipulated by a massive amount of data and slogans and trends. But what I was trying to say in my presentation, that finally in these specific topics that are very important for a society like energy, politicians should step a little bit away or aside and leave the technicians, engineers, physicists, all the technical people to really work together to arrive to the really structure and design that each country needs, because each country is different. So that's my point, but the reality is different. Politicians are there, will still be there. They will manipulate everything. They will tell the population that this is good and this is bad, and they will produce the policies to support their political agenda. And at the end, we customers are the ones to be paying the party, like we say in Spain.
Thank you, guys. Any other questions? Gerhard, Oliver, you're very quiet. Any questions?
Yeah, I was very carefully listening, and what I had in mind was partially already answered. It's about, do you see, and that goes to all the experts here online, do you see also possibility for gradual upgrade, or would you rather see a dramatic change in the system? Because what I have heard is more and more, especially in Germany, utility operators, that they are planning to upgrade existing systems gradually, like instead of burning coal, rather having possibilities to burn gas, which is still carbon footprint, but better carbon footprint than coal. Having also an upgrade of the existing grid in the sense of having higher possibilities to store kinetic energy inside for better stability and so on. So not the big bang transition from one system over to another, but more a gradual development of existing infrastructure. Because we're not talking about a green field, we're talking about a brownfield operation here. So what's the expert's view on the speed of this transition? Will it be a complete change, or would it be rather a gradual modification?
I like to offer the following perspective. If you are going to change any burning technology, any combustion technology into new renewable energies, being wind, or being solar, photovoltaic, or thermosolar, you need to multiply the power by 4. So 1 gigawatt of a power plant needs to be substituted by about 4 to 4.5 gigawatts of wind, solar, or whatever. So you need to do that, and then you need to have storage on the side to have stability. So obviously that cannot happen overnight. So that's the long answer to say that that is going to be an evolution more than a disruption.
Yeah, I agree with Pedro. But anyway, what we can see now is that mostly all the available investment and financing in the electricity energy sector nowadays is towards renewable energy, especially here in, I think globally, but in Europe, for example, is like that. Utilities, independent power producers, developers, all are towards developing renewable energy projects. And what we are seeing in Europe is that the base load, coal fire and oil gas fire power stations are being closed, and these sites are being refurbished, modernized with new renewable projects, being solar or wind of a massive scale. For example, here in Spain, we have all the coal-fired power plants being closed in a very fast pace. And all that sites now, what the private sector want is that the interconnections being tendered by the government. So there is a competition of which are the best projects on a euro per kilowatt basis, because if not, the utilities will be doing their projects in their view. But anyway, on the technological point of view, this huge penetration of renewables are having a lot of impacts in the power grid. And that's why in 2016, the European Commission issued the grid code. There are a new set of rules for interconnection of new projects. There are creating a massive number of requirements of projects that has to be accomplished in order to connect to the grid. This translates in new cost for renewable projects. Let's say that the cost of generation has been declined, but the requirements are going up. So basically, we are now in our companies doing advisory and engineering services to developers and private companies that are developing projects. And they were used to do the designs of the plants as the old style, basically rule of the thumb and general rules. But now they need to take into account strict regulations to connect to the grid, because basically the grid operator are facing challenging operation scenarios. So what they are translating are these problems to the generators. So this translates in investment in new technologies, new equipment, and new designs.
Yeah, and I would even say that we're already in that transition stage that you're initially talking about before the big disruption comes. I mean, if you look at the German energy mix, I don't know the exact number right now, but it's over 25% of their generation is from renewable assets. And on certain days of the year, they have negative energy pricing because they have to incentivize consumers to take that energy out of the grid. Otherwise, they get what's called an overvoltage situation, where they will actually explode components in their grid, transformers, inverters. And so the transition has already been happening, and we're coming to another technological point where we have different difficulties, and now we have to take those difficulties into account before transitioning into the next part. So I think that slow transition has already been happening. I mean, the first renewable projects were in 1977 in California, and to today, where now it's becoming such that the levelized cost of energy, or the cost for you to receive that energy from renewable project, is decreasing lower than traditional plants. And so now we start to see a quicker uptick in why investment is going into renewable assets versus going into traditional assets. And so when you talk about doing a changeover of a plant, if you're going to go, say, from coal to gas, you still have to expect that you're going to amortize that asset over 20 years. And so you have to determine, well, in 10 years, will the cost of renewables be even cheaper, that it is in a viable asset in the 10 to 20 year mark. So there's definitely going to be this transition, and there is this transition time period. But I mean, I'm for nuclear, so I would like to talk more about that. That's for sure.
Oh, I'm also from nuclear, but I like to say that when there are these conferences, they usually do the same trick, that is comparing the cost of energy in the wholesale market of the traditional energies and the renewable energies. And that is true, that the renewable energies are now cheaper than the fossil fuel. But there is a fundamental difference, is that a solar PV plant operates around 2,000 hours a year, and a gas-fired power plant can operate 8,000 hours a year. So you cannot compare that cost at that level. That is a trick that population can understand. It's very simple, that they get that the renewable energy is cheaper. No, it's not cheaper because you are comparing apples with potatoes. It's
Right.
not the same. So in order to have a fully professional debate, you have to compare, for example, gas-fired generation or nuclear generation with solar plus storage, or wind
yes.
plus storage.
Right.
Nobody's doing that because they know that if you do that calculation, the price of renewable plus storage is nowadays higher. So let's say the mantra collapses and they continue telling you the same slogan. So reality is much more complex. And what they are driving is the opinion of the population towards one thing that at the end, nowadays is not a huge benefit for you.
Right, but then the European Union with the European Battery Alliance and decreasing the cost of per kilowatt hour of lithium-ion battery is expected to be below $100 per kilowatt hour by 2023.
Yeah, but in the storage arena, you have to also to differentiate into the let's say the range of battery storage is for mostly hours, maybe. But the grid, sometimes they need what is called the seasonal storage. That is what pumped hydro is doing in many countries, also in Spain. That is storing energy during, for example, winter to be produced in summer. That cannot be overcome by batteries. Batteries are for short periods of storage and injection into the grid. So again, it's much more complex than saying, let's put a lot of batteries because the cost is going down and then, I don't know, we will implement. Also, there is a very nice conference in which Bill Gates talks about the storage, the batteries. And they say, for example, the case of Tokyo, in which they have maybe 3 or 4 days a year in which they have a typhoon. And what happened with a city that for 3 years, for 3 days, they need a consumption of 20 gigawatts? What kind of battery do you need to install in that city to overcome the loss of generation from wind and solar because of climatic conditions during 3 days for the whole load of Tokyo? The battery is astronomically enormous and very costly. So depends on many situations. Of course, I'm not saying that batteries are not one part of the solution, but we need more other technologies. And for example, in Spain, in the energy program we have from the government, they already included like 10 gigawatts of new pumped hydro to be installed in the next 10 years. The problem is that regulation in Spain and permitting of this kind of plants is so complex that for sure we won't be able to put not even 1 kilowatt of pumped hydro in the next 10 years, because that projects are super difficult to go ahead with the regulation of a country like Spain. So I say the papers, the plans that the governments they issue are very nice and everything, but reality is much more complex.
So I think that we're just talking about the base load that we need. You need to have the base load that can be transmitted across different time periods, but on top of that base load, then you can have different, renewable assets or different profiles, renewable profiles. I completely agree that base load, and that's why I bring up the nuclear case load versus the traditional methods. But of course, traditional methods are much cheaper because they're already installed. But yeah, I definitely don't disagree with levelized cost of energy today being 1/4 of a coal plant. But I don't think that that's the same as saying that, levelized cost of solar during the daytime is definitely cheaper than levelized cost of coal powered during the daytime. Of course, then if you want to look at 100% renewable system, then you have to get into a much deeper conversation of how do you load shift and how do you transmit that energy to nighttime or different time periods. But yeah, I understand your point, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, I think Miguel is not available, so we should apologize him a couple of minutes, but I think that Oliver has a question. So please, Oliver, unmute your microphone and.
Okay, hello guys.
Please.
Can you hear me very well?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
First, sorry at all, I cannot pay a lot of attention, so I am recording the session because I have another meetings at the same time. This is crazy in remote working. But perhaps because my view or my perspective is a little more closer in my sector. We are in a charging development platform, a CPO, NSP. So we are developing the charging network in Spain and Europe. And we are facing very, very concrete and local problems. Just I want to question you about how do you see, because in our main problem about the power is we need to put, for example, 300 power or even more kilowatts. For us is a lot, but probably for you it's not a lot, but in the middle of the field. So what happened is, let's in Spain, the prices are crazy. I mean, I have a cost of more than $1,000, even if the charge is not working or is working, because in Spain, at least, the price is very focused on the price of the power and not in the consumption. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the main problems, probably is a law or policy problem. But we are trying to fight it with, we are thinking and making a business model based on accumulation and batteries. And even in our business plan, even in 2 or 3 years, even with the cost of the battery, is making profit to put, for example, I don't know, 250 kilowatts hour, and at the same time lower the consumption with the grid. So what do you think about this plan for this sector? Probably, as somebody says, batteries is not working for a city or for a main consumption, but in a sector like us, when I can, for example, make with machine learning and algorithms, I could know more or less if my charger is going to be 3, 5, or 10 cars per day, or 20, so I can make my calculations in order to be sure my battery is going to be at least 60% as usage, and the other 60% is grid, for example. What do you think about this plan?
So can I need to understand a bit better. You guys are already developing a smart charging platform?
Yeah, we are developing a charging platform across Spain and next year Europe.
And so you're coming from the hardware perspective?
Yes, in this question, because even I am a CTO, so I'm more in the software, but I know the whole solution. So sure. My asking is more in the hardware. In the same, we are making a calculation about software to make a combination of mixed hardware, making power from the grid and also by batteries. So the other providers is just, if I need 300 kilowatts for this charger, I contract directly to the grid 300 kilowatts. So what we are thinking is to put batteries to accumulation, so we can hire less than 300 kilowatts per hour.
I understand. So, I mean, that's a very economic answer based on what's the cost of those batteries. And in the current state, I mean, depending on, how much you're charging the electric vehicles for the electricity, but in the current state, it doesn't make economic sense to utilize batteries purely for like price arbitration, for example. So maybe sucking up energy in the early morning or in the middle of the day when there's extra solar and using it for nighttime. You can get different price tariffs from different utility companies that incentivize this. But as I said, batteries in the current state with only one business model don't make economic sense. On the other behalf, when you look at batteries and looking at them as flexible assets, there's 13 different services that they could provide the grid as a whole. The problem is that 3 of the services are for the generation side, 4 of the services are for the distribution, and 2 of the services are for the end customer. And so the problem is, how can you gain money from these different participants in order to actually make it entirely economically feasible? And I guess my short answer is that currently it's not possible because of regulations. But now my advice to you would be to work with a utility company that is intending to create a customer relationship because they are paying for these types of technologies rather because they're giving a better service to their end customer rather than they're making economic money from the efficiency of it. So
just to extend my question, I mean, we are talking about chargers in highways and remote places, not at home. And one, make a extent of my question. Do you think it's possible that the pressure of politicians and or the market about the EV charge and the extension of these chargers, because we are not the only problem with this. I mean, all our competitors have the same problem, because right now, at least you have 20 cars or 25 cars per charger per day. You're losing money only with the power fixed energy. So do you think there is a regulation, probably, my question is more for Spain, but probably is regarding all Europe, about making that the utility companies making less price or some pressure about to go down with the fixed price of power and compensate with energy price or something like that?
So you can talk to utility companies about what's called a purchase power agreement. And this is planning how much energy you will get from the utility company beforehand. And this might be a space to look into. It's just they're called PPAs. That might be of interest. I don't know, Adolfo, do you have anything else you want to say?
Yeah, but what I can say for Spain, I don't see in the next 2-3 years for battery storage regulation environment that will create their economically and financial implementation. Nowadays, all the schemes that have been deployed by utilities are underperforming and losing money. So as I said in my presentation, regulation should be ahead of the technological developments, but nowadays is way behind the technological developments. So your situation right now is that the regulation is not adapted clearly, and it's not also a problem of politicians. It's also a problem of the transmission system operator that is stopping this development because they need to analyze so many scenarios and so complex that they need a lot of time to approve the regulations that the politicians want to implement. In this case, in Spain, is Red Eléctrica, is the one that is stopping basically all these regulations to be correctly implemented, because basically they need to go down to the physics, and they need to simulate how this will be impacting the grid. So as a summary, I don't see in 2-3 years that battery energy storage in all their forms will be practically implemented in Spain.
Okay, I have a clear answer about the regulation and so, but about perhaps I'm probably misunderstanding something about, or I don't know enough of the sector, but what do you think is not theoretically profitable to make batteries storage in this model concretely? Because our first calculation about cost of the battery, maintenance, cycles, makes that probably we have a return of investment in 3 or 4 years. I mean, not immediately. What do you think is the problem with this technology to use?
Well, the problem is that financial models are Excel file with hypotheses. And when you come to reality, what I was telling, for example, Endesa and Enel, we participated with them in 3 projects of battery storage, lithium-ion battery in Almería and in As Pontes. And their business models were profitable. They were giving services to Red Eléctrica. These assets are underperforming right now because it's very difficult to create an accurate business model nowadays, and regulation might change. So I'm not. I don't have the specific inputs of your financial model. But what I can say from my experience is that nowadays, even so, there are many companies trying to implement battery storage in different kind of projects. It's not feasible. I mean, they are losing money.
So you say main problem probably will be reality.
Reality normally is very difficult to model reality.
Okay.
And financial models, if you are very optimistic, you normally go to lose money.
Okay. Just to be clear.
Okay, Oliver.
Yeah, just to be
sorry,
clear.
because we are running out of time. I will give the chance to, if there is another question, short one, and if not, I think we should finish the presentation. Obviously, if you have, guys, more questions, I think we have the GVO platform, and also you have LinkedIn, so you can continue develop the knowledge, but we have a schedule, and we have stick to the schedule. Is there any more questions for assistance or?
Thank you very much for all your time and for the opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Adolfo, do you want to share a couple of words?
No, yes, thank you all guys for this interesting webinar, and I think you enjoyed what we have shared, and it was not so boring, and hope to talk to you. Thank you.
Benjamin, I pass the baton to you. You have
all I have to say
10 seconds.
I'm just excited that we're talking about nuclear so much. Other than that, I think
we need to do a webinar on nuclear only.
I would be interested.
Okay, thank you all you. Incredible presentation. We have to repeat it. Probably one focus on nuclear energy. Thank you to everybody, and have a nice evening. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you very much.
Bye bye. Thank you guys.